Snoopy's on his doghouse, and he has his typewriter with him, and he's going to write the great American novel. And he begins, "It was a dark and stormy night," which is kind of insider language for that's the way every bad novel has begun, with that cliched beginning. Well, it was a dark and stormy night at times in the life of Jesus. And we're going to look at one of those stormy times this morning from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4. As it happens, that is going to be our chapter for study Wednesday night. And as it turns out, the memorial service we had yesterday for Willie Salas, and today would have been his 56th birthday. This was a stormy time, or a difficult time, in which family members were facing into a storm. I didn't plan all of that, but it seems like it was appropriately timed that this morning we should elaborate somewhat on what we'll say more about on Wednesday night, as well as other material in Mark chapter 4. But let's begin with our text here from chapter 4, beginning in verse 35. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And this passage of Scripture is just loaded with interesting stuff. That day when evening had come, and actually that was the end of one day, and the new day began in the evening, Jewish time, at 6 p.m. So we're about to begin a new day, and the disciples of Jesus in this boat are about to begin a new experience, one which they don't really appreciate, but one from which they're going to learn. And Jesus suggests to them, "Let us go across to the other side." Keep that phrase in mind, because you're going to see it again, the other side. Verse 36. And I think I may need some help on this, Rick. Leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat just as he was. I'm not sure what Mark had in mind when he said just as he was. What's that all about? The disciples take Jesus in the boat just as he was. Well, just as he was probably very tired, because he spent the whole day up until the evening of that day teaching and preaching and healing and doing whatever as the crowds pressed in. So he didn't have time to go freshen up at a local restroom. They took him as he was, and he's apparently tired, is what Mark is trying to tell us. And other boats were with him. I hadn't noticed that for a long time. I thought this was a story just about Jesus and his disciples in their boat. Now I'm wondering, what are these other guys thinking who are in these other boats when the storm hits? It hit them too. The disciples are aware of why the storm stopped. These other folks are probably wondering. But he was in the stern, Jesus was, asleep on the cushion. Here you have a great storm, and it catches everyone's attention except Jesus, who is asleep on a cushion. They woke him, or got him up, and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" We talked a little bit about that this morning in the class. Isn't that kind of a strange comment? Here's a person who has the ability to sleep in a storm. He's awakened, and then those who awakened him begin to accuse him. What are you doing asleep? Why aren't you awake and going crazy like we are? It reminded me of Rudyard Kipling's poem. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, Remember that poem? It's a beautiful poem, and he goes through several scenarios where this goes wrong and you catch it, or this happens here and it doesn't change you into this negative person that you don't want to be. If you can resist all of these outside forces in causing you to do the wrong thing or to react the wrong way, he concludes it by saying, "You'll be a man, my son." Well, Jesus here awakens to everyone losing their heads, and he's the only one who's keeping his head. And Jesus gets up and he rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Again, it's loaded with content here. Jesus rebuked the wind. You have the same term used in chapter 1 where he rebukes an evil spirit and tells him, "Quiet, be still." Jesus has this power over the forces of evil and the forces of nature. And just as he rebuked the evil spirit, now he rebukes this out of control natural force and orders it also to be still and to be quiet. The wind ceased and there was a great calm. Now I hope you're noticing the repetition that Mark uses here of his words. There was a great storm, and then after Jesus rebukes the storm, we have a great calm. We're waiting for one more great expression from Mark. He said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And I'm wondering about still. Didn't they have some faith? Didn't they have a little faith? But he just says, "You have no faith." Do you still have no faith? After you have seen what you've seen, you've heard me say what I've said before, and you still have no faith. And they were filled with, there's our third great fear. A great storm followed by a great calm, and now there is a great fear. They were afraid during the storm. Now they are greatly afraid. They are terrified, some translations say. They're more afraid now than they were during the storm, because someone has power that is greater than the storm. They said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Well, we see some questions here in the storm. And anytime we go through a storm ourselves, our own personal storm, maybe not one out on the ocean. We wouldn't go out on the ocean or the Lake of Galilee, which was known for these unexpected, violent storms. It was situated between the mountains, and it was just a funnel for violent storms. We may not experience those out on the ocean waves, but we may have windy conditions or stormy conditions that we face, whether it's the loss of someone or a difficult situation. We go through storms. But I think one of the things that Jesus is trying to get across here during this time of storm, it is a time for faith to grow, time for faith to be built. The storms are not accidental. God, sometimes just to get our attention, has to send us through a stormy time. He has to send us through difficulties. And through those, he still is working. He's not asleep in the sense that he's unaware of what's going on. He never sleeps. He never slumbers. He is aware of what's going on, and he will bring us safely through the storm. The disciples asked two questions in the storm. They asked Jesus, "Don't you care?" And again, as we talked about in the Bible class, what a strange response. How can someone be blamed for being uncaring when he's been asleep? The storm and their fear is not something that he has necessarily caused. But this situation is here, and he's being blamed for the situation. Now, that may not be so unusual or so remote from our own experience. Sometimes when we go through a difficult situation and we see someone over here who's not as adversely affected by it as we are, we resent their calm, we resent their peace. But rather than saying it that way and recognizing that we've got something that's wrong inside of us, we tend to look at them and saying, well, you got a problem here, bro. We don't like to admit that this is my problem, it's my fear, but you caused it. You're part of the problem too here. Take your part of responsibility. That's what's behind this first question here. Don't you care? How can you be so uncaring to sleep when you ought to be going crazy like we are? How thoughtless of Jesus to not go crazy like them. And then the next question they ask is, who is this? You notice at the bottom of your outline in chapter 1, after Jesus had taught with authority and he had rebuked the demonic force with authority, the people say, what is this? It's a new teaching. It's a new authority. What are we dealing with here? The disciples are still kind of moving out of that what stage into the who stage. It's not any longer what's going on, what's happening here, but, ooh, wait a minute. Who? From what to who are we dealing with here? This is not your normal, we've seen the faith healers come along and they seem to heal somebody. They seem to have somewhat of an authority to do things. But now we've moved from what to who can command the natural forces. This is not normal. We've never seen anyone or anything like this. So that's their two questions. Jesus responds with two questions of his own. He asks them, why are you afraid? What's going on that makes you afraid now? Do you still have no faith? Still no faith? In Psalm chapter 4 and verse 8, the psalmist talks about the peace that he has in the storm. He will lie down and he will sleep, even though the conditions around him are not peaceful, because he trusts in the Almighty. Jesus is saying, could that have any connection to do with why you are afraid? That maybe you're not in connection with the who that calms every storm. There's another storm that Mark will tell us about in chapter 6. And that is, Jesus is on the shore. His disciples are out on the lake of Galilee, the Sea of Galilee. And there's another storm that arises, not as violent as the one in chapter 4, but it's windy enough, and they're not making any progress in rowing the boat. And Jesus decides he'll help. So he strolls out to where they are on the water and asks them, how's it going? And of course, you're thinking, how did you get here from there? I don't see a boat. It's tradition to go across the lake in a boat. Did you just stroll over here? And he again says, peace, be still. And Jesus, when he tells the wind and the waves to be still and to be at peace, he's also, I think, wanting his disciples to overhear that. I want you to be at peace. I want you to be still and know that I am God. Where is your faith? Why are you afraid if you're still and you know that I am God? Faith doesn't change the storms. We may still have to deal with the storms. It doesn't stop them. We may have to go through them. And that's one way that some translations give that initial verse in our reading, let us go over to the other side. Some say, let us go through to the other side. We're going to have to go through something. And so he may be giving them a hint of what lies ahead, and then he goes asleep until he's needed. Well, we can see here, I think, 3 different types of fear that come out of this storm. Number 1, the fear that comes from the unknown or comes from ignorance, what we don't know. Okay? We might not have all the information that we need to deal with the storm. Something is going wrong here, and we're in a difficult situation, and we're not fully aware of why this person is doing that or not doing this. And so sometimes it causes us to fear because we're not fully informed of all of the facts. And you notice here how they appealed to Jesus when they woke him up. The first word, teacher, don't you care? That tells us something about how they thought of him at that time. He was a teacher. There are many in our culture right now who have an appreciation for Jesus because they think he was a wise teacher and a good person. Jesus wants to make them transition not only from that view of him, but to the one that would call him Messiah, Lord, the Lord of heaven and earth, the Lord of the seas. They don't say Lord, they say teacher. Wake up. We got a problem here, and you need to be a part of the panic. They say, don't you care that we're perishing? If you look on the back page of your bulletin, the disciples probably had some faith in Jesus, but their faith was not yet full grown. And how do you get the faith that enables you to survive the storms of life? The only answer I know is to get in the boat with Jesus and ride with him wherever he wants you to go, through the storm or no. Where there are no storms, there is no danger. Where there is no danger, there is no fear. Where there is no fear, there is no testing. Where there is no testing, there is no learning. Where there is no learning, there is no growing. And where there is no growing, there is no faith. So Jesus wants them to grow in their faith. Where is your faith? Here is the shorthand version. Where there are no storms, there is no faith. No storms, no faith. Few storms, a little faith. Many storms, much faith. So it is for all of us who follow Jesus. There are no shortcuts along the pathway of spiritual growth. So Jesus says here to us through this story that some of our fear may be that we're not fully aware of who's in the boat with us and what resources we have as we go through these storms, through these difficult times. And if we are living in that kind of unawareness or that kind of ignorance, then fear may take the place of faith. What you actually have here is the beginning of 4 stories that Mark tells. And you'll notice as you get into Mark chapter 5, he will tell 3 more stories. And in every one of those 3 more stories, you have fear on one side and faith on the other. We'll get into that as we get into Mark chapter 5. But 4 stories, one right after the other, where we have to choose, will I live by fear or will I live by faith? And Jesus is saying to us here, if you know me and if you know I'm with you and you call out to me, I can relieve those fears I know the whole situation, and you don't. Number two, well, before we get into number two, let me tell you what the disciples didn't yet realize. They said, don't you care that we're perishing? No. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not, what? Perish. If you knew that, your fear would not be as great as it is. Should not perish, but have eternal life. And then the passage from Peter, and my guess is he's the one that woke Jesus up. I mean, they probably all had a hand in it, but I'm thinking that the big fisherman, who was astute at putting his foot in his mouth, probably led the way. Don't you care? We're perishing. Get up and panic. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish. Maybe that word came back to him because it's been part of his past vocabulary. But everyone to come to repentance and to come to faith. And then one final one here. In Corinthians, Paul told those folks, the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. There is life in death. The cross is about death, but it's about the resurrection. It is about Jesus being laid in the grave in the storm of crucifixion. But then God woke him up, rose him up from where he was. And he said to him on that third day, wake up. Come up out of Hades, up out of the grave. That's a foolish message to those who are perishing, that you can live after you've died, not to those who have faith in Christ. Secondly, there is the fear that comes from a challenge. I think this is significant. Remember that first verse that we mentioned? Jesus said, we're going to go to the, where? The other side. They've been on the east or on the western side of the Lake of Galilee. That's where Jewish, respectable people lived. But on the east side of the lake, the Decapolis, that's where all those pagan Gentiles live, the people that aren't worth your time, worth your attention. You don't care about them. You don't want to associate with them. And if you happen to meet one of them at a well, you certainly don't ask her for a drink. Those are the rules, okay? Fear that comes from a challenge. We're going to go to the other side. We're going to go to some unfamiliar territory. We're going to go to where you don't like to be. And I'm going to take you through to the other side, through a storm. You won't like it, but you need it so your faith can grow. So they arrived, chapter 5, verse 1. They arrived at the other side of the lake in the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus says, we're going to go to the other side, you will get there. And that's an important thing for us to learn and to believe. I don't know if we're going to get there. There's this storm. There's this overpowering thing that is sweeping over us right now. And I know you wanted us to go to the other side, but this storm is going to cause us to perish right here in transition. No, peace be still. They arrived at the other side. When Jesus promises you that I will take you here, believe him. I don't care what you face in between. When he says you're going to the other side, you will arrive. There's a challenge here to get through the storm. There's a challenge to even want to go to this other side where I don't belong. I'd rather stay where I am. I'd rather stay in my comfort zone. I don't want to go to where things are different, where things are a challenge. I don't even like the way those people look over there. I don't like the way they smell. I don't like their attitude. There's nothing about them that I like. Why would I want to go over there to where they are? I remember several years ago, I'd seen this guy around town pushing a cart, one of the homeless, and he was in the library. And he had one section all to himself. The section that I like to frequent, where the newspapers are. And he was right in the middle of that. Lots of empty chairs around him. And as I kind of passed by and went to the book section, I knew why he was alone. He smelled. I don't want to go there. You ever taken somebody somewhere, a passenger, and you knew before they got in that when you came back home by yourself, you're going to have all the windows down, airing the thing out? I don't want to go there. That's a challenge. That's the other side. That's really different from the way I look at things. But we need to have our thinking challenged. We need to have our comfort zone made uncomfortable for us at times, to where we can go to the other side. Who do they meet? Who is the first person they meet when they get to the other side? I call him Cemetery Man. He called himself Legion. What's your name? Jesus said. Legion. There's bunches of us. Well, he didn't wear any clothes. He lived in the cemetery. That's 2 strikes against him. And he had this way of cutting himself. How can you help someone like that? I don't know. But that's the first uncomfortable one that they met. And Jesus heals him and rebukes the legion of demons that he has power over. And then, interestingly, it's the people, the townspeople. When they see this, it says they were what? Afraid. And they say to Jesus very politely, as best they can, would you leave? I mean, with that kind of power, the next thing, that might happen is you might want to deal with some of our craziness. You might want to cure me of whatever it is I'm dealing with. A challenge. And a lot of times, most of our challenges are dealing with difficult relational issues, to where we don't want to go there. But we need to go through that sometimes if we're going to grow in faith. And finally here, there's a different kind of fear, the fear that comes from awe. When Jesus rebuked the wind and the waves and there was total peace, they were greatly afraid, or in awe. I think it's similar to what Isaiah felt. He was in the temple and the presence of God, just his robe, just a part of him, descended into the temple and had filled the temple. And he knew he was in the presence of utter holiness, unlike any he had ever been in the presence of before. And his first words were, woe is me. I'm undone. What do you think your first words are going to be when you see Jesus face to face? Hey, glad to meet you. I don't think it's going to be that glib and casual. When we see him as he is, and he sees us and knows us as we are, Isaiah is probably going to come to mind. Uh-oh, woe is me. I don't belong here. And he will say, peace, be still. I can bring you through what you need to come through to be in my presence forever. The fear of awe was something that the early church had. All the believers devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the fellowship, and to sharing in meals, including the Lord's Supper, and to prayer. When it says they broke bread, we're not sure if that's the communion, the Lord's Supper, or if it's a common meal, or both. But they were devoted to that. And a deep sense of awe came over them all. And the apostles performed many miraculous signs and wonders. If we spent time in the boat with Jesus, as we go through the storms, we might have this sense of awe as well, to how his calming presence is there in this great storm that we're going through. All the believers met together in one place and shared everything that they had. Let that be our goal, to live with this kind of fear. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, Proverbs tells us. If we want to live wisely, if we want to live with faith, the fear of the Lord, living with a sense of awe of what he's doing, what he's done, what he will do, is the beginning of wise living. And John puts it this way to soothe our hearts. Such love, when we become more loving as we are loved, has no fear, because perfect love expels all fear. If we are afraid, it is for fear of punishment, the kind of trembling fear, not the fear of awe. When we're afraid of God in the sense of he's going to whack me again, this shows that we've not fully experienced his perfect love. And we know that whatever he takes us through to the other side is out of love, is to build our faith. Then this sense of awe and thankfulness will come. If you'd like to respond to that and to ask his presence, to ask his help for whatever your need, will you do that while we stand?